Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
We're live at the Miami Book Fair, powered by Life Improvement Radio. You can go to my website, tolltutor.net, for more information. Twitter, tolltutor, Neil S. Haley, Facebook. And honestly, I had no idea Bill Ayers was coming on the show. And when I tell Jason, the public school guy, tonight, I had Bill Ayers on my show, he is going to absolutely be shocked, especially when I get it on Twitter at one point in time. But when you're going live, you got to keep rolling. And I'm telling you, I could have this guy on for a long time as well, Eric. And so, Eric, you could see it was like a kid in the candy store when I was interviewing Bill Ayers.
Yeah, you were.
Especially when he talked about his passion and education. Oh my, wow! And he really disagreed with Barack Obama and Secretary Duncan, which I have to commend and say thumbs up, because again, our education system is messed up, and I could say for Bill Ayers. But I want to welcome the program. As an educator, this person we're going to talk about is truly one of my favorite people of all time. So I want to welcome the program author Brian J. Jones, author of Jim Henson, the biography. Brian, thanks for coming by the makeshift studios live, and I'm so excited to talk to you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And Brian, ultimately, this book fair is fantastic, isn't it?
It's huge. This is my first one, and it's like Comic-Con for grown-ups.
It really is. And putting so many creative people in a confined space could be dangerous, you know?
Yeah, it's really inspiring, actually.
Absolutely. And Brian, when we talk about Jim Henson, and a lot of times I want to talk about the book fair, but when I find an interesting topic, I just roll with it. And if I'm going to have time with you, I could have about 52 segments about Jim Henson. And honestly,
yeah, he's easy to talk about.
Oh my gosh. And just all the different things that we learn about Jim Henson and specific things. So why, first of all, did you write the book? It's a cliche question interviewing an author, but really it's leading to a lot of other things. So why did you write it?
Sure. I always say that I'm sort of Muppets Generation 1.0 because I was the perfect age. I was 2 when Sesame Street debuted, so I was the target audience for that. I was 9 when the Muppet Show debuted. Sort of the target audience, though Jim wanted that for the whole family, but I was perfect age there. I saw the Muppet movie in the theater. I saw Dark Crystal in the theater. I saw Labyrinth in the theater. I remember when Fraggle Rock debuted. So the Muppets and Jim were always something that I knew about my entire life. I was sort of raised on the Muppets. And I was also this really notoriously nerdy kid that read the credits on everything. So I knew there were people that did these things. I knew the Muppets did move with a life of their own. So I had read a lot of stuff about Jim. But there was actually never anything written about him. It was always about the work, and rightly so. But this is sort of the first time that he's ever been in the spotlight, ever been the subject of a book about him. It's usually just been about the Muppets or his art, things like that. So it was a book that was sort of timed to do it.
What was it like doing the preparation for the book? Did you talk to a lot of folks that worked with him directly, or did you have to do a lot of research? What was that process?
Yeah, all of the above. I mean, it was a 5-year process. The first 2 years, though, was talking with the family to convince them to let me do it, to convince them to let me use their private archives. And they're like Jim. They like to have a good relationship with the people they work with. They like to feel good about it. They like to make sure you don't have a weird agenda or anything like that. So it was a lot of back and forthing and hot and cold and up and down for quite a long time. But once they say yes, you're a made man. And after 2 years, when I got my yes, it was off to the races. And I interviewed, every major Muppet performer. I sat with Frank Oz 5 times, and I talked with Jerry Nelson, who did The Count, and Snuffleupagus and Gobo Fry, who just passed away. I talked with him up in Boston, and I interviewed people on Skype, and I talked with Steve Whitmire, who does Kermit down in Atlanta, and Dave Bowles in Burbank, where he was filming a video with OK Go using Gonzo. So I got pretty much everybody I could, all the major players for sure, and then talked with a lot of people over emails and Skype and so on. And to a person, I mean, what's really great about Jim, there's really nobody who ever says, no, I don't want to talk about Jim Henson.
That's awesome.
Well, absolutely. What would you say is one thing that you learned about Jim that you never knew about him before, Brian?
I think there were sort of 2 things. One is, first of all, what a spectacularly good businessman he was. It's one of the things you sort of suspect about him because you can't have a company that straddles the ocean with offices in New York and London unless you're a good businessman. But he was really good from day one. I mean, he started his own company. He started performing on TV when he was 17, still in high school. Formed his own company while he was still in college, was making money hand over fist doing commercials while he was still in college. and knew his work had value. And he had his agent, Bernie Brillstein, at one point got this really lucrative offer to market Rolf the dog to Purina Dog Food. They wanted that to be their full-time mascot, and they wanted to purchase that character outright. And Jim, he's in his early 20s, turns to Bernie Brillstein. He says, Bernie, never sell anything I own. He knew that he was good. He knew his work had value. So when it came time to market and merchandise Sesame Street, the Muppet Show, Jim owned all those characters. So a really brilliant, intuitive businessman. But then the other thing I want to sort of throw in, because it relates to his business sense as well, is how almost pathologically conflict-averse he was. Jim and his wife, they were separated at the end of his life, and for the last 7 years of his life. And his probably biggest shortcoming is he wasn't always faithful to her. But he wouldn't even fight with her. I mean, he just was conflict averse, and it crept into his work. He couldn't discipline his employees. He didn't want to be bothered with the drama in the office. He didn't want the lawyers looking to him for his opinion on things. He just wanted them to handle it. So I thought that was really interesting. I mean, you can't really do what Jim does unless you're a genuinely nice guy, but he was almost genuinely nice to an extreme. He just could not handle that drama.
Wow. That's interesting, and I can only imagine the amount of staff and with as large as his company was, the amount of people that he had to quote unquote manage, or decisions he had to make, because it was rather large.
Yeah, it was never like when Disney was planning to take to buy his company. It was David and Goliath. I mean, they were this huge corporation. He was about 100 and some odd employees. It was never huge, but he did have offices in New York and offices in London, and he just had this personality that was so powerful that wherever he was tended to feel very special and loved, and wherever he wasn't tended to feel really neglected and kind of angry. So if he's in London, New York's mad. If he's in New York, London's mad. And Jim was calling in advisors and team builders and people like trying to do these things for him. All they wanted to do was just be around him, and he just couldn't be everywhere at one time. It had to be really tough for him.
It had to be,
And then what's amazing, Eric, is, sorry to interrupt, is that what we're seeing from Jim is that really he's like everyone else, a normal guy going through the same tough difficulties in life and trying to manage his life, his family, and business. Right, Brian?
Yeah, and I think I think that's ultimately why he wanted to sell to Disney, was because he wanted to sort of get that albatross off from around his neck. Not that again, he was a great businessman, but the day-to-day drama of running his company was just starting to get to be a little much for him. So putting that company in the hands of Disney was going to take him out from under that, and he could go off and just be creative 100% of the time, which is what he really wanted to do.
Absolutely. We're again talking to Brian J. Jones, author of Jim Henson, the biography. Now, I guess when I look at his greatest development, what do you think his greatest accomplishment was? The Muppets, would you say, creating certain characters? What would you say was his biggest accomplishment?
Well, I mean, the Muppets for sure is his biggest and his main legacy, and because we'd like to talk about education. Without the Muppets, there really is no Sesame Street. I mean, yes. Sesame Street works and worked immediately because of the Muppets. He was so important to the development of that program. He wasn't one of the original sort of CTW team that created it. He was brought in. But the CTW, Children's Television Workshop team, knew that they wanted puppets on Sesame Street, and he was so important to that process that John Stone, who was one of sort of the founders of Sesame, said, if you can't get Jim Henson, you can't have puppets on Sesame Street. I mean, he was that big and that important in the process. So, without the Muppets, you don't have Sesame Street. Interestingly enough, you've got the Muppets in the first episode, in the first 13 or so or 14 episodes of Saturday Night Live, a place you don't really expect them. He was, Jim's part of, two major institutions day one right there with the Muppets, which, is surprising. But the other thing that's really, I think, important about Jim is he really went with the technology. Jim was this technology junkie. He was one of the first to use CGI. The opening credits of Labyrinth with that owl flying over the maze, that's all done in the computer. Jim loved those gadgets. And so that's why, when you think about what could have been, Jim would have been in seventh heaven, or somebody told me 10th heaven nowadays, because of just, all the things you can do in the computer and all the things. And, Jim would have loved YouTube. He loved that democratization of the technology where anybody could make a film.
And that's the thing. And so when you talk about Sesame Street, so Jim basically kind of historically, he created Kermit the Frog before the Muppets in a way, right? So he created certain characters that were on Sesame Street before he created the Muppet Show and all the
right.
The
yeah, Kermit actually came out in 1955. He's one of the first characters Jim made, and he wasn't even Kermit the Frog. He was just sort of Kermit the Thing. Jim had this show he did twice a night in the Washington, D.C. area called Sam and Friends, and it was Sam, who never spoke, was sort of this human puppet, and then all these abstract characters around him. And Kermit was just one of those many characters. And it's really hard to look at his photos now and not think of him as a frog because he still sort of looks the same. But he's got big padded oval feet, and he doesn't have his little frog collar. But he was a really versatile puppet, which is the reason Jim used him a lot. There's not a lot going on in there except your hand. So Kermit came about in the mid-'50s, and gradually, as Jim said, they frogified him throughout the 1960s. And so by the time Sesame Street came along, Kermit had been a frog for about 5 or 6 years at that point. But Jim throughout the 60s had a lot of different projects that didn't involve Muppets, and a lot of the Muppets he was using for commercials and things like that we don't even necessarily recognize, And he had done the Menomina sketch on the Ed Sullivan Show. That transferred over to Sesame Street at one point. But in the 60s, he did a lot of experimental filmmaking, and he did a short film that was nominated for an Academy Award called Timepiece, and he did this bizarre sort of avant-garde Twilight Zone-y thing called The Cube for NBC Experiments in Television. A lot of really interesting creative stuff without a Muppet in sight, because in the 60s, he's kind of trying to figure out what he wants to be, what he wants to do. Does he want to do more than just the Muppets? Does he want to be a filmmaker? But then Sesame Street comes along, and that's sort of the exclamation point at the end of the 60s for him.
I think it's really interesting to hear that he had his hand in other projects and had some other creative outlets besides the Muppets, because I think as soon as you say his name, it's the only thing that people default to is the Muppets.
Yeah, I mean, and he was always he always loved, again, playing with the technology and doing things differently and doing things new. That's one of the reasons Dark Crystal was such an important film to him. He wanted to go out there and do something new, do something that wasn't the Muppets. And the poor guy, when you're reading the transcripts and going through the archives of the interviews he was doing at the time promoting it, the first question he gets from everybody is, "Where are the Muppets?" Like, people just didn't get it. And Jim had to play defense, explaining what he was doing the whole time rather than promoting his vision. He really loved building that world. I mean, what's so great about Dark Crystal is everything in that film is handmade. Everything exists. There's no special effects in there. They built everything you see on there. Jim loved that world building. And he would talk about how, you couldn't just, if you needed a chair, you couldn't just grab a chair from the prop shop. You had to figure out what kind of trees grew in this world. And if you made a chair, what would it look like when you cut the wood across the grain? And, how would it be shaped? I mean, he loved thinking about that kind of thing.
And I think that's something that we've lost nowadays because everything has gone computerized, and no one, we're not building sets anymore. We just have 1 or 2 actors in front of a green screen. Everything else is computerized, and put in place.
Yeah, I think Jim would have loved green screen technology and do it, but for him, what's important about Jim is Jim always understood the character came first. That was, and I think that's why of all of them out there, that's why Pixar still does it so well. Pixar gets that. They understand that the character comes first, that story comes first. Jim with story wasn't always his strongest point, and that's sort of the weakness of Dark Crystal and even Labyrinth to some extent. But everything's always very well thought through. Nothing is ever on screen that doesn't look like what Jim wanted it to look like. He knew how these things were going to look. He knew how they were going to work. Everything in Labyrinth, for example, looks exactly the way that he wanted it to, exactly the way he drew it out. You see his storyboards, and it's like, it comes out right on the screen.
That's amazing.
And that's the thing about the passion about certain people. They come up with their creativity and their geniuses in so many ways. And for education and children, he truly knew what kids wanted.
Yeah, and he never talked down to kids. And one of his producers commented once that one of his daughters had come in while they were really busy editing film, and he was really, really busy. And his producer's like, I couldn't even have been bothered, and yet Jim stopped, turned around, talked to the child right on her level, got right down and spoke with her. And Jim has this quote where he says, children don't remember what you say, they remember what you are. And I think that's really important. You can sit there and talk at them, whatever, but when you're talking to them, when you're being yourself, that's what they remember. And Jim knew that. That's why Sesame Street works so well. That's why it works on so many levels. That's why the Muppet Show works on so many levels. Jim got that.
Absolutely. He got it, he understood it, and he was ready to move with it. And do you think once finally getting out of it, and you said selling to Disney, was that hard for him?
No, it really wasn't. I mean, a big part of it was there were 2 things he wanted to be sure happened with Disney. And again, he was really trying to get out from under that sort of the idea of chasing the overhead, having to worry about the day-to-day management of the company. Disney was going to take care of that, but he had 2 things he wanted to be sure, and they were going to sell it for like $150 million. It was a big budget, big project. But Jim wanted to be sure that they took really good care of the Muppet performers because, again, he kept explaining to them, if you don't take care of the performers, you're getting a box of puppets, and that's it. And that's not what you want. You want the Muppets. If you get Miss Piggy, you need Frank Oz. You got to take care of Frank Oz. If you get Gonzo, you got to take care of Dave Goelz. He was really trying to make them understand that puppetry was hard work. You couldn't just put that puppet on anybody's hand and have it work. The one thing he wanted to be sure was that he could stay involved in the hiring and training of performers. But the other thing he really wanted was his own independent production company, so he could go out there and do whatever he wanted. And that's the real sad story of the lost, potential there. Because what would Jim have done with that production company? People said that Jim had this ability to walk away, which, is true. He's got the Muppet Show on the air after 5 years, and typical Jim, he says, that's a really nice show, takes it off the air so we can go make movies. Fraggle Rock, hugely successful. Without Fraggle Rock, there is no Sopranos. There is no Game of Thrones. It's the first HBO original series. 5 years, Jim says, great, nice show, takes it off the air. So some people thought that Jim was going to sell to Disney and say, the Muppets have been great, let them take them over, I'm going to go do something else. So you really don't know what sort of wonderful things Jim might have done. He loved playing in the Disney parks and building the attractions and coming up with ideas. But with that production company, man, he had his, it was his bat cave, and who knew what he was going to do with that?
Quite interesting. All the things, Eric, that Jim Henson was able to do in his career. To hear that in the memoir, fantastic.
I know how many millions of people still to this day are captivated by the movie. I mean, they're still making them. Didn't one just come out last year?
One in 2011, and the new one's coming out next spring, and the trailer just went online, and I got to say, it actually looks terrific. That's the one that was going to count. The last one was to reintroduce them and get them out there, and this is the one that's going to keep them, and boy, the preview looks great.
Yeah, I mean, when did you say Kermit was established in 55?
55, yeah.
Wow.
It's out of Jim's mom's coat. That's why when you see the Kermit in the Smithsonian, he's blue.
That's hysterical. I never knew it was originally made out of a coat.
Yeah, it's his mother's coat, old discarded coat with a ping pong ball cut in half for the eyes.
That's awesome.
So I guess Jim knew once he was able to sell it to Disney that his people would be taken care of, and he thought of others. And that's where I guess the whole thing comes from. He definitely gave back in those ways. But it's interesting also to hear what you talked about his life.
Yeah, I mean, Jim, really, he believed that, projects had to matter. I think that's one of the reasons that everybody still loves Jim's work is because for Jim didn't do these things casually. Projects had to have meaning. Things had to matter. Something like Fraggle Rock. When he got his Fraggle Rock team of writers together, he went into them like the first day with this sort of rallying speech, and he's like, "Okay, I want to do a show that's going to stop war." And Jerry Joel, one of the writers, said, there's not an ounce of cynicism in Jim. Only he could say that and absolutely mean it, and you didn't laugh at him because Jim was that optimistic. The world mattered to him. He really wanted to make a difference with these things.
Well, absolutely, and it's something that when you make the difference and you're able to change people's lives, and that was his whole idea, transforming people's lives. And what has been the response so far to people who have been Jim Henson's fans? To hear that he had his life in turmoil in certain ways.
Yeah, but, for the most part, Jim is, I always say cynics need to be aware on this because Jim really is pretty much what you think he is. I mean, genuinely nice guy, But apart from the difficulties in his marriage, I mean, his biggest faults after that were probably he liked to buy expensive cars, he liked to buy houses and decorate them with expensive art. It's not terribly bad. I mean, Jim was sort of a genuinely good guy. There's not a lot of big gossipy moments in there. It's more about watching somebody sort of follow their bliss and be creative and be successful at it, being creative. Making money and not feeling guilty about that while he's out there being creative. The reaction I've heard from it's funny. I was just standing in line here at the book fair for lunch, and somebody behind me came up and we were sort of chit-chatting. He looked down and he saw my name tag and he's like, "I'm a Sesame Street performer. I love your book." I mean, it's just it's so great to just run into people who have read it and love it. And a lot of Jim's friends and colleagues and people he's worked with have all written to me and said, you got it, you got him. This is Jim. I mean, that's what's hugely rewarding about it. Is Frank Oz says, "I learned things in this book I didn't even know. You really got him," which is just huge. It really means a lot.
Absolutely, and it's something that. So I'm interested to hear that you got them, you understood him, and that's so key. And Eric, I think that with Brian tackling a project like this, that's a challenge because again, as he talked about off air, he didn't really know Jim, so he chose this, and he chose a person that's such an American icon in so many ways.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. I mean, it's hard, at least to me, as a child growing up, like you said, I watched all those shows and witnessed all those shows, and it was really enjoyable. And to kind of take someone who's an icon for so many children and even adults around the world, it's hard to put that in and make sure that you can do it in a factual, realistic type of basis, and put it into a story. I think it's exciting, but I think it'd probably be a little overwhelming as well.
Well, I got to tell you, I mean, there wasn't a day went by I didn't, stand and look at myself in the mirror and say, please do not screw this up. I mean, it's just, he's too important to people. Sesame Street is important to people. The Muppet Show is important to people. Dark Crystal is important. There's so many things he did that are so important to so many people that, every day I just think, you just do him justice. You got to do not screw this up. So it's nice to know that I did not screw it up, I think.
That's good. What was the family's take on it? Did they really enjoy it?
Yeah, they did. The family was really supportive. I mean, the book's not authorized per se. They cooperated with me 1,000%. They all opened themselves up to. I talked with all 5 of the kids. I talked with Jane for hundreds of hours. I let them read the first draft of it. They fact checked me. Thank God they did. I had a major chronological error that they all caught. But they were really receptive and willing to talk about things even that were not necessarily comfortable for them. I think the hardest thing for them to read was the bit about Jim and Jane's marriage. And Jane was great. I mean, she was wide open about it. The first time I sat down with her, she talked about her marriage with Jim. But I think it was very difficult for them to see, that and all the other information I had, other people I talked to, stories she had that none of them had heard, and sort of tell that story. And, you're sort of reading your own life in third person from a stranger, which is a really tough thing to do. But they, again, they were great, and we had long conversations. They said, where did you find this? Who told you this? So I had it really aggressively footnoted so they could see everybody I talked to and how did I make this conclusion and where did this come from. And when they could see that I had taken the process very seriously and documented things, and I wasn't making huge leaps of faith, and was being very careful about things, they were okay with it. That's when they realized that okay, this is going to be the real work. This is not going to be gossip.
Very cool.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So where can we purchase your book and learn more about you?
It is available in bookstores everywhere. It's available from your favorite book websites. I've seen it at Costco, although Costco is one of those that they can sort of select them locally, so I've seen it in some and not others. But Costco, Barnes & Noble, all the small independent booksellers, it's everywhere.
All right. Well, fantastic. Thanks for coming by, Brian. Best of luck in the book. I know, again, what a great topic, and I'm sure that the book fair is enjoying hearing about what you learned about Jim Henson. So thanks for calling.
Hey, it's been my pleasure. This was fun, guys.
All right, take care.
Thanks.
All right, that was Brian J. Jones. You're listening to Authors Corner, powered by Life Improvement Radio, live at the Miami Book Fair, and we'll be back in just a moment.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.